Um, so that's nice. Hello, everyone. My name's Alex Karner. For those of you that don't know, I am currently a postdoctoral researcher at CEDEAS here at Universidad Católica in Santiago. And I'm going to be, in the fall, starting an assistant professorship at the Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech, in the School of City and Regional Planning. And today I kind of wanted to talk about some of the work that I've been doing at a postdoc for a couple of years now. So this work kind of draws from my entire sort of body of work throughout graduate school, and then sort of I'm going to get deep into a couple of projects that I've done during my postdoc years. So it's all on the sort of topic of defining and measuring public transit service equity. And I think that it'll be helpful if folks hold their questions to the end. If I'm on a webinar, I tend to get distracted if stuff is popping up. So that would be really great. And just a note for everyone, I guess, my work is pretty US focused. So I'm going to talk a lot about kind of the US context and laws and guidance and regulation. Hopefully I give enough background, but I think that the lessons that we can glean from the US case are really widely applicable to anyone that's concerned about equitable transport or equitable public transit systems. So although I draw from the sort of US framework, it's a widely applicable the results are widely applicable. And I encourage folks to follow along on Twitter. If you want to tweet at me during the talk, you can definitely do that. This is my Twitter handle. Okay, so let's get started. So I want to talk for a minute about transportation equity and think about what it is, and give folks an idea that there are sort of competing definitions, and then it'll help to sort of situate my work. You can sort of see where my work falls in the sort of broader space of transportation equity. And in the contemporary era, I think we can trace it back, in the United States at least, to the 1950s and 60s. Urban freeways started going in. There were a number of freeway revolts in different cities. A lot of the freeway revolts were motivated by folks that were not too happy that freeways were going through their neighborhoods. The freeways in the United States tended to go through low-income neighborhoods that were populated by minority residents. And there was, around this time also, a lot of urban unrest. So I've got a picture of Watts, Los Angeles here. This was a really serious urban riot that went on in the United States in the mid-1960s. There was a commission that was formed to look at the causes of the riot called the McCone Commission, and they identified transportation as a key factor. They said Watts was isolated from opportunity, didn't have adequate public transit, was kind of beset by highways on all sides. And then we sort of go along conducting transportation planning until we get to Ice-T in the early 90s. This was a piece of one of the transportation authorizations in the United States. And Ice-T said, look, we can't keep doing transportation planning as we've done in the past. We need to consider a number of different things. We have to consider social, economic, and environmental impacts. And this started to sort of tune us into the fact that, okay, transportation is really important for these outcomes, and we need to do something about it in our planning. And then there was a bunch of other guidance, legislation, executive orders that came out after Ice-T that sort of support this. And I'm going to talk about a couple of them later on. But what we're seeing now is there's quite a bit of advocacy around this idea of transportation equity. So this is one definition of transportation equity coming from a pretty well-known civil rights organization in the United States. And they say that transportation is a civil and human rights priority. Access to affordable and reliable transportation widens opportunity. Current transportation spending programs do not equally benefit all communities and populations, and that there are negative effects of some transportation decisions. And these can be broadly felt and long-lasting. So a lot of ideas embedded in here, that the idea that transportation provides access to opportunity. We have a system right now that is currently not equitable in some measures. We don't know exactly what those are. And that there are also negative effects of transportation systems. So if you have a highway that's built beside your house, sure, that highway provides additional access, but it also carries a number of costs. So that's kind of the advocacy side. They're really focused on sort of identifying these disparities and then doing something about them. And then I think from the agency side, so what are transportation planning agencies in the United States doing around this? There's a really illustrative example that comes from the Bay Area. A lot of my work in the past has been focused on the Bay. In 2004, they had there was a sort of decision point. They had been working with what was called the Minority Citizens Advisory Committee. So this was a committee that was established by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the Bay Area to advise the commission on issues of importance to minority citizens. And they proposed the adoption of 4 principles to basically get at this idea of transportation equity, to try to make a more equitable transportation system. So 4 principles here. They wanted an empowering public process where everyone could participate and have their voices heard. They wanted data to be collected to get at these questions of inequities. So what are the important inequities? How do we understand them? How do we track them over time? How do we know if things are getting better? And then 3 and 4, they wanted to actually change investment patterns at the MTC so that any inequities that were identified in Part 2 would be mitigated. And the final point was that they wanted projects to have to mitigate any disproportionate effects that were identified before being approved for funding. Often projects are approved and then only later are they analyzed, even though disproportionate effects might be evident from the get-go. So they wanted those things sort of addressed in a proactive manner. But what happened was MTC adopted the first 2, so creation of an empowering public process, collection of data, but they declined to adopt the last 2. So there's this emphasis at the agency on sort of process and data, but not necessarily actually doing something to change anything. So there's this often a distinction made between process and outcomes. Agencies are often focused on process, and the advocacy folks are usually focused on outcomes. So I think that's sort of a good way to situate where my work falls. I'm really interested in using data for sure, but using data to sort of understand disparities in a meaningful way, and then having results that are actionable that agencies or advocates can actually use to sort of help decision-making or to help advocacy. And so some of my past work has dug into this in quite a bit of detail. So I have a sort of recent stream of work that looks specifically at regional transportation planning agencies, what they do in terms of equity analyses. And I have a sort of review paper and then one that gets a little more into the weeds, looking at how to do these things better. So we're moving from, a lot of agencies are moving from a sort of zone-based 4-step model system to an activity-based model system. There are a number of new data sources that are emerging. How can we use those to basically do a better job at getting at equity impacts? And so for interested folks, I point you to these couple of papers. If you're interested in a copy of this one that's under review, I can share that with you. But I mentioned also that I want my work to actually get used. So when I was working on my dissertation, I was actively involved in with a number of groups that were sort of organizing around the regional transportation plan that was adopted in 2013. And they were able to successfully propose their own transportation and land use scenario that the agency analyzed. So I helped them sort of formulate that scenario, and then pointed the agency towards metrics that could be used to analyze its performance relative to the agency's preferred plan and a number of other plans. So this is really sort of like where my work lies, doing the analytical work and then tying it back to advocacy and getting real outcomes in the world. And that leads us to the couple of recent academic studies that I'm going to talk about today. So like I mentioned, my prior work was really focused on regional transportation equity. But one of the things that comes up time and again is this issue of public transit. And it turns out that there's a pretty substantial legal framework that transit agencies operate under. They're some of the most highly regulated agencies in the United States when it comes to things like equity and civil rights. So I wanted to sort of dig into what they had to do, see how meaningful it was, and see if we could come up with some better ways to do it. So I want to start by just thinking about this issue of transit equity. And again, this is really US focused. I assume, well, actually, I know that it's quite different in other parts of the world, but if you bear with me, we'll get to some results that I think are quite widely applicable. So we know that there are a number of reasons why we have public transit systems. There are some really good reasons. I want to focus in on these last two, congestion and air quality mitigation. and the provision of basic mobility for transit-dependent populations. These two are pretty interesting because they're often in tension. So when we think about congestion and air quality mitigation, we're thinking about getting commuters out of their cars. To get commuters out of their cars, we have to provide high-quality service. We're often thinking about commuter rail systems, sort of gold-plated transit systems. And then basic mobility for transit-dependent populations is often provided by local bus. And those two things are sometimes in tension. And we can see that from some of the new data, some new analysis that was conducted by Brian Taylor and Eric Morris. They were looking at the 2009 Household Transit Survey, or National Household Travel Survey in the US. And they looked at some demographics of transit-dependent riders and these choice riders. So choice riders, as I mentioned, definitely typically using commuter rail service, and they tend to have much higher income. So their median income is about $62,500, whereas the median income of transit dependents is about $22,500. Importantly, the median income for the choice riders is indistinguishable from automobile users. So this leads Taylor and Morris to conclude that the bus is the mode of the poor. And this isn't necessarily a problem, right? So we can imagine a situation where we have two groups of transit users. They both enjoy service that is useful to them, that sort of connects them to where they need to go. They pay a fair price. But we know that rail transit service has been expanding faster than bus transit service over the past 25 years in the United States. Bus patronage is declining. And so that what's happening now is that we still have most transit users in the US going by bus, but the numbers of bus and rail riders are kind of converging over time. And a number of authors have identified that there's been a sort of shift in public transit policy to serving choice riders with premium service, so things like commuter rail, to the detriment of transit-dependent users that are relying mostly on local bus. But thankfully, there's a sort of legal basis that's kind of pulling us in the other direction. That's saying, okay, well, maybe this isn't where we should be going, and in fact, maybe this is unlawful if our transit systems are developing in this way. And that's Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Title VI says that if you're an agency that receives federal funds, you can't discriminate in your sort of distribution of those funds, of the services that you develop using those funds. And DOT, the Department of Transportation in the United States, has gone further and sort of operationalized Title VI, and it says that fund recipients cannot discriminate with regard to the routing, scheduling, or quality of service furnished to patrons. So if you have two different groups of patrons, you can't, it's actually unlawful to provide different service to each of them. But actually understanding how we quantify service, how we quantify different groups of patrons, it turns out to be a really challenging question, and one that's actually not really well understood in practice. So what happens in practice is that transit agencies typically evaluate the equity of what's called a major service change according to Federal Transit Administration guidance that's contained in this circular, the FTA circular 4702.1b. This is great bedtime reading. If anyone wants to print it out and have it at their bedside, I would guarantee it'll put you right to sleep. Now, the process has been contentious in both Los Angeles and the Bay Area, and I think part of the reason is that the FTA circular is actually pretty specific in some regards about the data and methods that are required, but what I'm finding is that the data sources, different data sources that can be both sort of justifiably applied to this problem can potentially lead to different results. And even within the FTA's guidance, agencies have a lot of discretion to sort of conduct the analysis in ways that they see fit. And I wanted to give a couple examples here to show you that, you know, these sort of equity analysis, these service and equity analyses, have real impacts in the world. So this is one project that is now actually operational from the San Francisco Bay Area. It's called the Oakland Airport Connector. The Oakland Airport Connector is a $500 million project, and it was going to replace a bus link between the heavy rail system in the Bay Area, it's called BART, and the Oakland International Airport. Now, the project was contentious for a number of reasons. It was going to double the fare. provided no intermediate stops, even though the corridor over which the new alignment passed was heavily black, heavily low income. And BART didn't conduct a service equity analysis as they were required under federal law. So the Federal Transit Administration actually withdrew $70 million in funding. Now, BART was able to backstop the funds, and so the project went forward. But this was occurring at a time when local bus service was being heavily cut. So AC Transit is the local transit provider. They disproportionately serve riders of color in part of the Bay Area, and they had been cutting service miles, running fewer trips, and increasing fares. So the optics of this just looked really bad, and I think that, you know, at the end of the day, if we're considering how money is being used in the Bay Area, this was not a good project for transit equity, even though it makes a number of airport users very happy. LA Metro is another place where this kind of stuff has come up recently. So LA Metro was kind of ground zero for some of the transportation equity, for sort of some of the modern transportation equity work. There was basically a big civil rights complaint, and LA Metro had to run more bus service, hold bus fares constant for a 10-year period. The court order under which they were doing that expired, and then they immediately cut about 400,000 bus service hours. And so a number of groups in LA complained. The Federal Transit Administration agreed, found Metro in violation. Metro conducted a new service equity analysis, didn't change anything about the planning that they were doing, the service equity analysis didn't materially change anything, and then FTA said that they were in compliance. So I think this particular piece, this service equity analysis, is actually really important. Doing a good job at it can sort of tell us, things, how well our system is performing if we conduct it in the right way. If we conduct it in the wrong way, it can sort of just tell us what we want to hear. And so I really wanted to understand, how well do these things work? How well does the service equity analysis work? So before I was here at Católica, I was in Phoenix, Arizona, at Arizona State University. And so we had a good working relationship with the transit agency, so I conducted the couple of studies that I'm going to talk about are both based in the Phoenix, Arizona area. So Phoenix, for folks that don't know, before I moved there, I was a little horrified, but it's actually quite nice. It's the 6th largest city in the U.S. with about 1.4 million people, so it has, urban kind of amenities. It's also the 12th largest metropolitan area. But the urbanized area increased 7-fold from 1950 to 2000, so this is kind of during the heady time of automobile dependency. And as a result, or at least due in part, only about 2.4% of the workers commute using transit, which is about half the U.S. average rate. So it's very car dependent. I was walking and biking in Phoenix, and I was often the only cyclist or pedestrian on the road. That said, Phoenix does have a multimodal public transit system operated by Valley Metro. They're the transit operator. And they've got a number of different modes of service. So they're at a very basic level, there's light rail and bus. But then within bus, there are local routes, and then there are kind of express and rapid routes that provide premium service, typically during the peak period. So bringing commuters into downtown during the peak, taking them out in the afternoon, and fares are a little higher on those routes as well. So I wanted to sort of walk folks through the typical process that an agency goes through when they're thinking about conducting a service equity analysis. So in the first step, you have to look at your service area. So what are the demographics of the service area? And there are two ways to get at the service area demographics. One is to look at every bus stop, every light rail stop, every transit stop in your system, draw a Euclidean buffer around it, and then add up all the people in those buffers using census demographics, and then calculate proportions like this. So if we do that for Valley Metro, the gray buffers here are quarter-mile buffers around bus stops, and then the red light rail alignment here is a half-mile buffer. So we can do that, intersect those with our census blocks. We show about 1.7 million people in those buffers. They're 52% people of color and 28% low income. We can also look at the system-wide ridership. So instead of looking at census demographics, if we have onboard survey data, we can use those to define our service area demographics. If we do that, we get about 240,000 daily riders on Valley Metro. They're 56% people of color and 50% low income. So two different data sources, different sort of results for our service area demographics. Once those are set, we have to look at a service change that we're proposing. So here I'm imagining that we're a transit agency, we're Valley Metro, and we want to improve service on Route 39 that runs along 40th Street. So to do that, we have to look at our demographic buffers here, quarter mile around all the bus stops, intersect those with census blocks. We can see that the Route 39 is 77% white, 23% people of color, 17% low income. We're then going to compare those demographics to our service area, and we can see that the white population on Route 39 is greater than our service area population, and the low-income population is lower than our sort of system-wide demographics. And so if we want to just improve service on this route without doing anything else in our system, there's going to be a potential impact there. So there's going to be a potential impact of the service improvement because it appears to be disproportionately benefiting a white population and a non-low-income population. So there are a number of limitations here. One is that either census data or ridership data can be used for sort of various steps of the analysis. And there's no reason to believe that those two data sources would give us the same answer. Most of the analyses that I've come across have been based on demographics proximate to stops. So these are census data, not ridership data. The academic literature has taken a similar approach here, and I think part of the reason is because these data are simply easy to work with. Everybody has access to them. They're freely available. You don't have to run an expensive ridership survey. And because there's precedent in the academic literature, it seems okay for an agency to sort of just use those data. Now, as an additional consideration, those analyses are based entirely on demographics. They have nothing to do with thinking about how well the transit system is actually working for different people. So given the sort of long history of accessibility analysis in transportation studies, I wanted to see if there was a way that we could think about bringing accessibility into the discussion. As folks probably know, accessibility measures the potential to meet desired needs, and it's essential for understanding transportation system benefits. So it's not enough just to have a bus stop outside your door, but we want that bus stop to take you to places that you need to go in a reasonable time at a reasonable cost. And so I wanted to look at whether we could supplement the demographic analyses using accessibility. So I have a couple of research questions that I'm going to address. One is, how consistently do the existing methods characterize the equity of transit-related decisions? And second, how can new data sources aid with equity determination? And I'm specifically thinking about using Google Transit data and incorporating accessibility. So the first study is looking at observed ridership and census demographics. And in terms of data and methods, I basically wanted to set up a comparison between the census demographic approach and the ridership approach. So I was able to get onboard survey data from Valley Metro from the most recent onboard survey. And then I grabbed census demographics from Summary File 1 on race and the American Community Survey on income. And some of the results that I'm going to describe are reported in an in-press paper by myself and colleague Aaron Golub. If folks are interested, I'm happy to share that as well. The basic approach was to take the census data, buffer it as prescribed by FTA, and then get line-level ridership demographics based on the census, and then comparing those to the results from the onboard survey. So once we have those two data sources assembled, we can do a number of sort of interesting comparisons. So the first set of results I'm going to describe are sort of descriptive, and then I've more recently done some modeling of the results to figure out, how systematically we can characterize differences between demographic groups, between modes. So this figure is showing the demographic proportions that we would expect grouped by mode based on the census data in green and the ridership data in orange. And there are a couple of things to point out here. I hope that folks can see my mouse cursor. So the white demographic population here is in the bottom right. And we can see that in general, on these premium modes, remember I mentioned the express service is premium mode, rapid service is a premium mode. White ridership is generally higher than we would expect if we were just using census demographics on those modes, okay? And in general, it's a little bit lower on light rail and local modes. The light rail in Phoenix, often we would think of that as kind of being a premium mode, but it doesn't really serve a commuter ridership. It's very much sort of focused on downtown. So it functions, light rail in Phoenix functions more as sort of a local mode than as what you would think of as a traditional light rail. If we look up here at the Latino pane, we can see that the Latino ridership, measured in orange here, is actually lower than the census for all modes. For the Black population, their actual ridership of light rail and local modes is higher than we would expect based on the census. And those differences actually go away if we look in the people of color category. So if we merge all minority populations into a single category, some of the differences we get actually disappear. So that indicates to me that we actually don't want to be lumping everyone together, but we want to sort of consider them separately. So big takeaway points from this figure: white ridership is higher than the census on premium modes, Black ridership is higher than the census on local modes, and Latino ridership is lower than the census in all cases. We can also look at the route level. So what I'm plotting here is sort of breaking out that previous figure. So each route has a number of plotted points here for different demographic groups. So what we're showing is, on the y-axis is the proportion of ridership that we would expect based on the actual onboard survey. And on the x-axis is the proportion that we would expect based on census demographics. If the numbers are above this gray line here, the one-to-one line, then the ridership numbers are actually higher than we would expect based on the census. So we can see this sort of cloud of orange triangles here representing the Black population, showing that their ridership is generally higher, although not in all cases. The white population seems to be a little bit higher mostly, but is actually kind of spread out. Latino population, these pink crosses, generally lower ridership than we would expect. And then if we mix everyone together into a single people of color category, these yellow asterisks, that difference kind of goes away. And we can show similar results for income. So I'm showing a couple of ways of operationalizing income here. One is below 15,000, that's going to be generally low income group. That's the green circles. The orange triangles are below 25,000, another low income group. And then above 50,000 would be a higher income group. And we can see that in general, the lower income groups have higher ridership than we would expect based on the census demographics, and the higher income groups have lower. So again, indicating the importance of sort of splitting these things out and sort of hinting that if we use census demographics, we're not necessarily going to be reflecting actual ridership. So I've been recently trying to think more systematically about these. So, okay, can we understand the conditions under which census demographics are a good predictor of ridership? And these are some preliminary results that I'm writing up, hoping to submit to TRB. So the first model here is looking at, all the models are looking at the proportion of riders at the route level based on the OD survey, or the onboard survey rather. And then we're using census demographics to predict the actual ridership. And then I'm looking at individual racial categories, so estimating a different model for each racial group. And because the dependent variable is a proportion, not using ordinary least squares, using a generalized linear model. So we can see the bold coefficients here are significant. And if there is a blank, that means that the coefficient wasn't significant. So we can see right away that if we use just census demographics to predict ridership, we're going to do an okay job for the white population, for the Latino population, and potentially for the Asian population. For the Black population, we actually do a really bad job. We have no relationship at all. And if we look at the low income and high income categories, there's also no relationship. So low R-squareds for those groups. So it seems like census demographics have some relationship with ridership for some groups, but not for all. And the magnitude is quite different. So the coefficient for the white and Latino population, 2.1. It's much larger for the Asian population, indicating quite a different relationship between census demographics and ridership. Now we can start to add additional covariates, and perhaps the most interesting is looking at quality of service. So in the next set of models, I included dummy variables that indicated whether a mode was premium, so whether it was express and rapid, and then whether it was light rail. And we can see right away that adding these quality of service variables drastically improves model fit, so increasing by almost double. The black model now has a number of significant coefficients, much higher R-squared. So it seems like we need to take into account the actual quality of service when we're thinking about these relationships. The quality of service is going to affect the magnitude of the relationship between census demographics and ridership. So it appears to me, based on these modeling results, that it simply is wrong to think that there is a one-to-one relationship between census demographics and ridership. This is sort of not stated in the FTA guidance, but it's sort of the implicit idea behind it. I have another sort of way of summarizing these model results. Because these are generalized linear models, we don't assume that the coefficient represents a sort of constant rate of change over the whole range. So in order to look at how the predictions change over the range of independent variables, it's helpful to look at these plots of marginal effects. So that's what I'm showing here. On the x-axis, we have the census demographic proportion, sort of bounded by what we actually observe in the real world. And then the y-axis is showing what we would predict in terms of demographic proportions. And I've split out the results for local bus and premium modes, and then all the other variables are kind of held at their average to calculate these margins. And we can see the black population is represented by this blue line here. We can see that for local bus, they are the relationship between census demographics and ridership is very strong. It tends to increase much more quickly than it does for any other population. So again, this sort of different racial, different sort of scale, magnitude of the relationship between different racial groups. Then we move over to premium modes. We see that the white population here, represented by this red line, is sort of shifted up from local bus, indicating a sort of higher relationship between census demographics and actual ridership. And for the Latino population represented by the green line, it's lower, indicating that census demographics are translating less readily to actual ridership for premium modes. So again, some important differences. Now where the rubber actually meets the road here is if we actually think about how this will affect a actual proposal for a service change. So here I'm imagining we're looking at our rapid routes, and these are our sort of premium service, providing people that are on the periphery transportation into downtown core in the morning and back in the afternoon. So I'm Valley Metro, and I want to propose a service improvement. Now, there are two ways that I can do it: census demographics or ridership. If we look at the census demographics here, we buffer around our stops. We show that we have 48% white, 52% people of color, 48% low income. We're going to compare that to our reference population using buffers again. So the results show that the white population is the same, and that there's actually a higher low income population around the buffers of the rapid routes than there is in our reference population. This means that there's no impact under a service improvement. So if we want to improve service, Valley Metro could actually argue that they are doing a benefit to low-income households based on the census demographics. If we look at ridership, on the other hand, we show what we would expect based on the modeling results, that the ridership of the rapid routes is 76% white, 24% people of color, and only 11.5% low income. That means that it's whiter and higher income than our reference population based on the ridership. So there'd be a potential impact under service improvement. So two different ways of doing the analysis, two different results. So to conclude here, it's clear to me that the demographic data that you use as a transit agency to think about the equity of your service changes can affect the conclusions drawn regarding equity. So basically, one data source can be used to show one result or the other. Yet FTA considers both sources valid. I would argue that ridership is actually the more valid criterion, since it's actually people that are using the service. And now that I've started to develop the model results, I mean, one of the problems with the ridership data is that they're very expensive to collect. So we don't want to require every single transit agency across the country, across the world, to have to conduct an onboard survey every few years. So I want to think about whether there are ways to use model results like the ones that I showed to basically get at ridership using census data, perhaps doing a limited sample of routes or a limited sample of riders. What are the conditions under which we can apply those model results more widely, maybe across regions as well? So that's where I sort of see this work heading. Great. Okay, so on to the next piece here, which is the accessibility analysis. So remember I said, demographics are super important. We don't want to throw those away, but we know that that's only one piece of the puzzle. So how can we bring an accessibility frame into this problem? Now, the way that we historically have done accessibility analyses is using data like this. So this is a sort of snapshot of the Valley Metro, not Valley Metro, the Maricopa Association of Governments traffic analysis zone system for their four-step model. So I assume many folks on the webinar are familiar with four-step models. You sort of have these coarse zones, and we're interested in calculating with our travel demand model kind of levels of service between the zones. What are the travel times? What are congested travel times by transit? So we would historically get these data from an agency and then use those zone-to-zone travel times to calculate accessibility, so the number of opportunities potentially that are available within different time bands. There are a number of problems with this approach also. One is that these data are difficult to acquire. You have to rely on an agency's goodwill often to give them to you. They might give you one set, not another set, one set of model runs, not another set of model runs. It's not fun as a researcher to have to depend on someone else for data. Second is that they're not super temporally explicit. So you'll often get a single skim that's supposed to represent, a 3-hour peak period trip. And then finally, they're also quite large, especially if you want to think about public transit accessibility or any type of walkability. They go down to about 1/10 of a square mile in the downtown core in the Maricopa system, but they're up to about a square mile, not too far from downtown, where there still could be people walking. So if we want to think about, the actual landscape of pedestrian plus transit opportunity, these things are pretty coarse. So I've been putting together a number of data sources, and the results that I'm going to show are based on the sort of first iteration of my results. I've been updating them now with some more, what I think is actually a better way of operationalizing this, but I can sort of talk about that. But at a basic level, I'm using 3 sets of data. One is a pedestrian network that I grabbed from OpenStreetMap. This is just open source map information that you can translate with relative ease into a pedestrian network to understand how pedestrians can get around in your city. I combine that with block level demographics from the longitudinal employer household dynamics data set maintained by the US Census. These data are nice because they're very spatially explicit, and there's information on both workers and jobs, basically across the entire United States. And then I combine that with some GTFS data on transit stops, routes, and schedule to look at accessibility by pedestrians using public transit systems. So in terms of the nitty-gritty methods here, basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at pedestrian service areas around stops according to the FTA guidance, but actually using the pedestrian network to incorporate how far people can actually walk instead of assuming a Euclidean buffer, how far and where people can walk. Step 2, develop service area demographics. So there I basically match the demographics from the census with those service areas to figure out how many jobs and how many people live near transit. There's a lot of specifics that I'm glossing over there, but I basically do a bunch of GIS to avoid double counting jobs when I'm adding up all the accessibilities. And then in step 3, I look at travel time between all stops. So there are about 7,000 stops in the Valley Metro network. I calculate a travel time between each of those pairs using a 64-minute cutoff based on the OD survey that includes about 95% of observed trips. And then I'm looking right now at the 2-hour morning peak, assuming a departure within 5-minute windows, and the departure sort of occurs randomly within that 5-minute window. And this is actually pretty manageable. I've got like my laptop is pretty nice, but it can run this in about 7 hours. So I just can set it up before I go to sleep. And when I wake up, everything is done. And it generates about 22 gigs of data, but then I can sort of aggregate those down in various ways. So the final data set's about 2 gigs, and then I can get rid of those initial ones. And the tool that facilitates this is called Add GTFS to a Network Data Set. You can Google that if you're interested in doing this type of analysis. It's a nice tool put together by a woman at Esri named Melinda Meringue that sort of facilitates standard ArcGIS network analyses using GTFS schedule data. So once those are all set, then I can calculate my stop and route level accessibility. And the route level is important because that's kind of what we care about for doing transit accessibility analysis. So the way that I'm calculating accessibility, I'm going to show results from a couple of different operationalizations. But just imagine that we're sort of standing on a particular transit stop. I sort of look out at the universe of all of the other transit stops. I've already calculated a travel time between them. And I know how many jobs are there, and I know how many people live there. So for each stop, I kind of look out, and I'm basically just going to add up all of the jobs that I can get to from that particular stop and discount it by how far away those jobs are using sort of gravity model-based measure of accessibility. I'm calling that territorial accessibility because it just takes into account the opportunities that are available. It doesn't actually take into account whether people can live close by to those opportunities. And so the second measure that I calculate is a worker-weighted accessibility. So this measure actually gives people credit for living in areas where accessibility is high. So I'm just multiplying by the number of workers that live in each zone. And with the LEHD data, I can calculate this for different worker categories, low, middle, high income workers. I can calculate it for different racial groups. And then I can also, once I have it calculated for all stops, I can calculate a mean accessibility over an entire route and get that route level accessibility that can help us do our equity analysis. So these are some top level results for Phoenix, showing the territorial accessibility on the left, worker weighted accessibility on the right. Sort of standard result on the territorial side, accessibility is high in the downtown core where there's lots of jobs and lots of transit service, sort of radiates out from there. On the worker-weighted side, where we're actually wanting to make sure that people are living in areas where accessibility is high, we get a much more sort of spatially varied picture. And I think that the worker-weighted measure is actually sort of more reflective of how well a transit system actually works for people. So much of the literature has used measures like the territorial accessibility to say, look, transit accessibility is high in central city locations. That's also where we know like some proportion of low-income minority folks live. But that doesn't actually translate into outcomes for those people. I think the worker-weighted accessibility measure actually does a better job of sort of connecting those two things. So those are those results. Now we can also break it down at the root level. So in thinking about how to sort of conceptualize equity in accessibility using transit routes, as transit agencies would like to do, I've set up these comparisons. So I mentioned the LEHD data has high wage and low wage job information. So I can calculate for every individual route their accessibility to low wage jobs, compare that to their accessibility to high wage jobs, and then plot it. And if it plots close to the one-to-one line, we can say, okay, basically that route is providing about the same accessibility to both groups. And these are the territorial measures. I'm showing on the left pane comparison between low wage and high wage jobs, and in the right pane, mid wage and high wage jobs. Mid wage and high wage jobs are sort of more closely grouped. There's more variation on the low wage and high wage jobs, but in general, if a route provides high accessibility to high wage jobs, it's providing high accessibility to low-wage jobs as well. So it doesn't seem to be much disparity here. Similarly, if we look at the root-level worker-weighted accessibility, we see a little more differentiation. These dashed lines represent sort of one vertical standard deviation. There are a couple of routes that pop out. One is the Scottsdale neighborhood circulator. Scottsdale is a wealthier, whiter city in the Phoenix metro area. So there are a couple of routes there that are providing higher accessibility to high-wage jobs. And the Glendale urban shuttles Glendale is a sort of poorer area. Those routes are providing relatively higher accessibility to low and mid-wage jobs than high-wage jobs. So this is to show that if we're an agency, we're planning to improve service just on the Scottsdale neighborhood circulators, that's probably not going to fly. And if we wanted to cut service on the Glendale urban shuttles, that's probably not a good idea from an equity standpoint either. I wanted to tie this back also to the demographic analysis that's required. And what this figure is showing is it's combining the accessibility information with some demographic information from the route. So I'm showing routes that we would consider non-low income. So these are routes that have below the sort of mean proportion of low-income riders. Those are plotted in orange triangles. And then low-income routes, definitely low-income routes. These are routes that have greater than the mean proportion of low-income riders. And we can see that despite a number of non-low-income routes plotting to the right of this gray line, which indicates the median worker-weighted route-level accessibility, they're actually providing quite high accessibility. So this sort of group of orange triangles here is saying, okay, these are routes that are not, we wouldn't flag these as low-income routes in our analysis, but they're actually super important for low-income people because they're providing very high accessibility to low-wage jobs. So it definitely seems important to not just think about demographics, but to also incorporate accessibility. Now, there are a number of limitations using these data sets. One is that the thresholds that define low, mid, and high-wage jobs in the LEHD data that I've used are kind of coarse and they don't change over time. And also, they're just looking at actual jobs that exist in a region. There's no consideration of the unemployed. On the other hand, it also contains race data. There is information on occupational category, and it's updated annually. And the big thing that I like to do with all my work is make sure that I can use open source tools and methods. And basically, the methods that I've used here are completely reproducible, aside from relying in part on ArcGIS, which is not an open source solution. So to conclude, Valley Metro routes appear mostly equitable. Some of these new data sources allow for the development of more refined indicators of public transit accessibility than we've been able to make in the past. And we can combine them in concert with traditional demographic measures. Thanks for your attention. And I don't know how this works, but I assume you can send a chat or something. I don't know if you can actually talk. Okay, I see one question, but I can't. Okay, let me see if I can read it. How can I read analysis? I can't for transfers, in other words. Hey, okay, so question about accounting for transfers. And the answer is that it does account for transfers. So the way that the travel times are calculated is that you can basically undertake an unlimited number of transfers. So if you're at a particular stop, so basically I'm calculating accessibility at base at a transit stop level, that is going to account for, the accessibility I calculate at that stop is going to account for whatever transfers you can make to access other routes in the system and other opportunities that are available. So they are accounted for. Hey. Okay, Laurel has a question. Which agencies for the survey? Design one. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think the stuff that the data. So okay, sorry, I don't know if everyone can see this question. Laurel asked if there are questions that I wish that transit agencies would put on their onboard surveys because she's about to design one. I think that the data that I've gotten from Valley Metro are generally pretty good. I can share theirs with you. I mean, it seemed like they tried to do a really careful job of making sure that their sampling strategy made sense, that they got really good representation across all of their routes. So I think that my recommendations would be to make sure that you're doing a good job getting a representative sample across all types of different routes. And I assume that you're doing that. The one thing that I think is a challenge that hasn't been really well addressed and might account for some of the differences in results that I talked about is that the way that the race ethnicity questions are asked on onboard surveys doesn't necessarily match the census. And I don't know if that's a huge problem. So for example, in the Valley Metro case, they had one question that combined race and ethnicity. Whereas on the census, it asks ethnicity first, and then you choose a race as well. And it seems like the ethnicity question only applies to Latino folks, and it seems like a lot of people that choose Latino choose some other race, indicating that they're not really thinking about being Latino as an ethnicity. But I think that just making sure that if you ask that question in different ways, you get the same results. So I wonder, maybe there's an opportunity for you to do some kind of, you do 50% of the surveys where you ask a two-step question and then 50% has a one-step, and then you see if there's actually a difference. I suspect there wouldn't be, but it would be nice to know for sure that wasn't the case. Okay, another question here. Doing something similar. Okay, so a question about, I think this is a question about what I'm using to estimate the impedance parameter in the gravity model. And for that, I use the actual trips that were observed in the onboard survey. So because I'm looking at work trips and I'm looking during the peak period, I just took the onboard survey. The onboard survey is very nice. All the trips were geocoded, so I could just put those into GIS and then run the same type of GTFS analysis to get a travel time on work trips. So once I do that, I have my trip length frequency distribution, and then I can do a nonlinear regression to get an estimate of the impedance parameter. And it's for transit trips, what I'm finding is basically that they behave quite differently than automobile trips. So typically with auto trips, if you do a trip length frequency distribution, you see a lot of short trips, and then there's a sort of big tail that drops off quickly. With transit trips, there are fewer trips that are very short, and the mean travel time is much longer. So I'm getting something like mean trip of about 40 minutes for Phoenix. So I'm basically saying, okay, for transit, unlike for auto, riders have kind of a built-in expectation of sort of spending time traveling. So I weight all of the opportunities at 1 that are reachable less than the mean time. And then from there, there's a kind of soft decay that starts after that mean time. I'm happy to talk with you more about that offline if you want to just send me an email. And then another question about the difference between the worker weighted version and territorial. The difference is just that, so the territorial measure is just looking at the opportunities that are available. So what jobs can I reach by transit in sort of at every time, at every sort of time step. And the territorial measure says, okay, that's great, but we also want to take into account where people live. And so if there's a high number of workers that live in an area where accessibility is high, they're going to have a higher score for accessibility. So I'm just multiplying the territorial measure by the number of workers that kind of live in the service area around. Okay, great. Seems like that answered the question. Okay, excellent. Okay, any other questions from folks? Happy to follow up with people by email if you would like also. Raphael asked a question. I feel the relationship between ACS during the work commute by race or survey relationship. Okay, so Raphael asks, have you looked at the relationship between the American Community Survey journey to work commute mode by race to your survey ridership? And the answer is no, I haven't. I have not compared that. Okay. There's a detailed question from Anson. I can only read it one line at a time, which is frustrating. Let me see. Bus, rail, bus. Yeah, so Anson is saying maybe low-income riders are making disproportionately long or inconvenient trips. And I guess that could suggest that there would be different, and this is actually found. So we could account for that with different values of the impedance parameter. Joe Grangs has a paper that came out recently where he actually looked at this for auto travel, how the impedance parameter varied for different demographic groups for non-work travel in Detroit, and found that it did indeed vary. So that would potentially have the effect, if basically lower income people were willing to endure longer trips, then their accessibility could potentially look higher based on this result. That's a good point. Okay, great. So we're about at time here. I'm happy to answer more questions if there are some. I'll hang around for a bit, but thanks for stopping by, and I hope you enjoyed it.